America's Mad King George woke up to devastating reviews this morning of his latest turn on the world stage at the G7 summit and a stinging rebuke from the Democratic frontrunner to replace him in 2020. All this amid growing signs that his policy schizophrenia on trade with China may be plunging the world into a global economic crisis. New York Times today writes this, quote, day by day, even hour by hour, his approach to the trade war with China, the most consequential economic conflict on the planet, veered back and forth, leaving much of the world with geopolitical whiplash. The Times' Paul Krugman was even harsher, writing this, quote, the very stable genius in the Oval Office is in fact extremely unstable in word and deed. That's not a psychological diagnosis, although you can make that case too. It's just a straightforward description of his behavior, and his instability is starting to have serious economic consequences. And as Donald Trump's instability and impulsivity threaten to deprive him of his own best and strongest argument for his own re-election, the strength of the economy, former Vice President Joe Biden weighed in today with this statement. Quote, we have even more evidence of how President Trump's disastrous foreign policy has left the United States isolated while the world moves on without us. Rather than looking to America for vision, agenda setting, and leadership by our example, our closest Democratic allies sought to manage and mitigate the damage Trump might do at this year's G7. And considering the fact that the White House spokeswoman is still cleaning up the president's suggestion that Melania Trump and North Korea's murderous dictator Kim Jong-un are pals, when in fact they've never met, it's safe to say the president's critics may be onto something. Donald Trump as a political liability to himself is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Back with us from the Washington Post, White House Bureau Chief Phil Rucker, Senior Washington Correspondent for Politico Anna Palmer, at the table A.B. Stoddard, Associate Editor for Real Clear Politics, and Maria Hinojosa, Anchor and Executive Producer for NPR's Latino USA. Phil Rucker, I need to start with you, as we do on so many days. They are cleaning up the cleanup there at the White House today.
Yeah, that's right, Nicole. The president is back in Washington from this whirlwind foreign trip. And, you know, you described his activity abroad where he was making pronouncements and then changing his mind again and again and again throughout that weekend. But it's not all that different than how he has been behaving of late here domestically. I mean, the entire week leading up to the G7 summit was a number of flip-flops on key economic policies, beginning with that payroll tax cut idea and a number of other steps that really jolted the markets and left, business leaders here in the United States, as well as people in the government, pretty alarmed about the stability of this president and his policy making. That continued, obviously, overseas with the number of steps. And I think one thing that really stuck out in our reporting, I wasn't on this trip, but I was helping report on the fallout from here in Washington, was the president's private discussions about Vladimir Putin. He was an advocate on behalf of the Russian president in those private sessions with the other leaders of the G7 group, and it just further illustrated the gulf between the United States and its allies.
You know what, Phil, I was going to read from some of your great reporting about these imagined phone calls, and you pin in that and come back to it, because you just raised what's been the central question, I think, of the entire Trump presidency. Why did so many of them tell so many lies about Russia? And I know, we all know, Robert Mueller spent a long time looking at whether a criminal conspiracy, a chargeable, prosecutable criminal conspiracy had transpired. But if you go back to Andrew McCabe's sort of evidence that he looked at before he opened a full field investigation into Donald Trump and this question about collusion with Russia, it was precisely the kind of conduct you just described Donald Trump engaging in at this summit. And I think the cherry on top of the sundae was the elaborate lie he told about President Obama, this easily disprovable lie about why Russia had been kicked out of the G8. So my question for you is, what do you hear about the sort of digging in on, it's not even Putin friendly at this point anymore. It's Putin's bidding. We have in our president someone advocating more ferociously, more aggressively, more brazenly for Putin's political standing on the world stage than America's. What's behind that?
That's the mystery of this entire presidency, Nicole. I don't have an easy answer to it. And you're right, it goes beyond just simply defending Putin when he comes up, but it was Trump forcefully advocating on Putin's behalf to these other world leaders. There was a private dinner that the world leaders had at the G7 summit in France, where the discussion veered into the importance of democracy and whether a country has a democratic system of government should be a prerequisite or should be favored in terms of membership to the Group of Seven, which of course had been the Group of Eight. And all of the leaders except for Trump said yes, and Trump said no. And according to my colleague, Michael Birnbaum, who does terrific reporting out in Europe, someone in the room said it was as if Trump was the dictator himself in that setting. It illustrated for all of them how far away he was from the consensus of these democratic allies, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, and so forth.
I'm going to come back to your great reporting and Politico's great reporting, but you've taken us down a really important path, and I want to get you on the record on this. I mean, what Phil just described, under a president or a White House that doesn't do a volume business of mayhem and lies and chaos, would have stopped Washington in their tracks. If President Obama had done what Phil just described, if George W. Bush had done what Phil just described, at a summit, equivocated on whether or not being a democracy should matter, which is essentially what Donald Trump did. If behind closed doors, and obviously not much of an effort was made to keep it secret because it's been reported by Phil's excellent colleagues, we now know Donald Trump advocating more aggressively for Vladimir Putin. We know his body of statements about how we're killers too. There's nothing extraordinary about Putin killing dissidents. Why isn't there an outcry? Why is Joe Walsh the only Republican running against Donald Trump, the Republican? Why don't Republicans care anymore that there is an American asset of Vladimir Putin running the country?
It really is amazing because Joe Walsh, I don't think he's the most shrewd campaigner to enter a primary against a sitting president. But he talks about how the day in Helsinki turned everything for him. And that was such an incredibly dark day for this country. And it was for many Republicans who had to come up with some, I've got my shoes on too tight statements, but they didn't, categorically reject the president. They have not since subsequently uttered concerns. We have learned, no matter what the conclusion of the Mueller investigation, as you said, if it can come up with a criminal prosecutable charge, that the president lied about doing business with Russia, had to have the government's permission and approval and help and engagement to complete a Trump Tower Moscow project and continue to lie to the voting public about it. And that Putin knew that all along. He thinks of him as a once and future client, and he, as you said, was doing his bidding. It was, no matter what you think of anybody who was his predecessor, no matter their party, so deeply offensive to see him get up there and start lying as if Putin was this master tactician who outsmarted President Obama and who embarrassed him by violating the Ukrainians' rights and sovereignty and taking Crimea, that it was some kind of sporting event. And he just went on, and no one stood up and said, this is an American president talking about a previous American president in the most deeply unpatriotic and offensive way. It just disappeared like another day of the Trump show.
Why?
I just think, Nicole, as we've talked about so many times at this table, they've long ago acquiesced, and they believe it's time to put their head down and watch the tornado of next year's elections to sort of rip up all the concrete above them and come out afterwards, or that it's sort of too late now to clean up the mess they've made, like the White House has to do every day for the president.
How about on his stability? Because what the White House press secretary had to do, I was a White House spokesperson.
Oh, it was amazing.
White House press secretary today had to put her name and the weight of the American presidency, the White House, behind an official statement saying Donald Trump misspoke. Melania has actually never met Kim Jong-un. I mean, these aren't lies just made by a pathical liar. These are lies coming out of the mouth attached to a brain that I don't know what's going on inside of it.
And I just think they have days where they come so quickly that they're relieved that the press can't chase all of them. Last week, he made up that the log cabin Republicans gave him an award, but we were still following the Man of Michigan award that he'd made up 10 days before. And then, of course, he was tanking markets within a couple days, and he was talking about payroll taxes and flip-flopping on background checks and payroll taxes, so no one paid attention to the fact that he had created an award that a group gave him. I mean, these things happen all the time, and the White House press operation gets to just, in the midst of the storm, be so glad that people are paying attention to cars floating through the air, and they don't have to look over here and talk about, this building becoming unmoored. It is really, that's that intense a storm every day of lies, and the kooky ones, like Melania really likes the chairman, do stand out. But it's no Republican, when they come back from congressional recess, will say anything new about any of this.
And Palmer, there is new reporting, though, and everyone that has spoken, AB and Phil Rucker, have both invoked words that have usually just been whispered about Donald Trump: his instability, impulsivity, the lies not even being attached. I mean, I don't know why you would lie. It's not really helpful politically or diplomatically to say that Melania is pals with Kim Jong-un and gets along with him great. So they're lies with no purpose. They're lies that, in the case of the Mueller investigation, almost got him either indicted or impeached. Peter Baker writes this: the way he negotiates at times involves facts that may not be facts, statements that may not have been said, and episodes that may not have occurred. And at times he denied saying what he had said. Where are we?
I think when you look at that paragraph that you just read, it really demonstrates the frustration that comes in Washington all the time on Capitol Hill. I think you're starting to see that even more so with business leaders, with his comments on China, is that this president is not acting in good faith. I mean, he's a good negotiator. That's why we haven't seen anything happen on Capitol Hill. When you look at the debate that's going to happen on guns, when you look at what's going to happen in end of September with a government funding fight, is that they often don't feel that the president or this administration is acting in good faith. And I think there's a lot of Republicans, like AB said, they're not going to come forward after this August recess and have a lot of new things to say. But I think that behind the scenes, there's a great deal of frustration because nothing can get done and they don't ever know where this White House stands.
Phil Rucker, I do want to come back to your great reporting, your colleagues' great reporting on the trip. 68 minutes in Biarritz, a glimpse into Trump. I'm sure I botched that. I don't speak French. A glimpse into Trump's unorthodox mind. Trump claimed to have gotten 2 phone calls on Sunday night from high-ranking Chinese officials seeking to negotiate a trade deal. High-level calls, he said. Chinese government officials said Monday that they were unaware of any such calls. When Trump asked Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin to back him up, Mnuchin would only say there'd been communication, avoiding the word call. The Treasury Secretary quickly interjected again Monday afternoon to add communication. So now we're down to it depending on what the definition of call is. What's going on? What are they lying about and why?
Yeah, and it's not just the calls, Nicole. Trump announced while he was overseas a trade deal with Japan that does not exist. There is no trade deal with Japan that's been actually announced. And a number of other instances where he claimed things that the other leaders told him, including, he said, the most common question that he was asked by other leaders at the G7 was, why does the American media cover him so badly, or something along those lines. I really don't think any of those leaders asked him that, or if they did, they certainly haven't revealed that publicly. I mean, what's going on is basically a continuation of a pattern we've seen throughout this presidency, where Trump creates sort of an alternative reality that favors him, that suits his base and makes him look like the hero. And he repeats this, and he tells these stories at his rallies. He tells them to the reporters. He embellishes, he exaggerates, and yes, sometimes he lies. This is not altogether new, but it was just so many examples in such a short window of time this weekend on the world stage as he's representing the United States at this annual important summit of world leaders in France. And, to a lot of people watching, it was pretty alarming.
So we have, serious reporters talking about the body of evidence around the pattern of lying. around the instability, around the erratic nature of policymaking, around the complacency of Republicans, essentially waiting for, the eye of the storm to pass them and to assess the damage. What is the case to be made by someone perhaps with more credibility than someone like Joe Walsh about the president's fitness for the office he holds?
Whoa. I mean, the thing is that for me, the $64 million question is, well, one, what is it going to take to make it move? I mean, is it a double bolded headline in the New York Times and the Washington Post? This president has lost his mind. I mean, what? I don't understand. I'm trying to see, like, part of what's happened is that we have gotten into this pattern, and so it's like, well, it's more of the same. It's more of the same. So it's like, what is it going to take? Which leads me to the question of, like, wow, Republicans, wow, really? You are prepared to just squander all of this? You know, when I think about the fact that, and you know this, Nicole, it was the Republicans who had the upper hand on the issue of immigration. This was their issue. They owned it. I remember thinking, wow, George W. Bush, if he does this immigration reform, he will have
Kennedy and McCain.
He will have the Latino vote guaranteed for who knows how many decades. Of course, that all changed. So it's more like, what motivates them to just kind of sit back? And, you know, I don't like talking about this, but I have to say, you know, when you ask the question, if it was Obama who was doing this, if it was a woman who was doing this, if it was a person of color doing this, if it was an immigrant, it would be just like, you know, hair on fire. And it's kind of like there's just too much proximity to another white guy. And so there's like, no, because he's just like us. So something's gonna happen. And it's like the rest of us are saying, no. And what is it going to take? I mean, you asked that question. That's why everybody watches your show, Nicole, because you're always asking the question, what is it going to take?
But I'm a voracious consumer. I read everything written about the White House from everyone's organizations. And I ever since David Brooks wrote in 2017 that Republican senators emerged from a closed-door meeting with Donald Trump, and some of them thought that the fact that he repeated himself over and over again, that he displayed the early signs of Alzheimer's. In my brain, that stuck out as something to come back to. I then remember when Bob Corker made a valiant effort to sort of say out loud what many, I worked for Republicans for 20 years. They say things in private that they do not say on shows like this. Bob Corker was saying out loud what dozens were saying in private, that Donald Trump, you're smiling, you know this to be true, that Donald Trump does not display the competence for the office he holds or the stability. He's now a retired senator from Tennessee. I mean, I guess what I see in the reporting are undeniable proof points that the instability is now having dangerous repercussions.
I mean, Nicole, the last time I was on the show with you, I was from El Paso, and I was like holding back tears because I was traumatized by what I was witnessing. It's like the people there, I told you, they are making the connections here. So again, what does it take? I mean, the people in El Paso were saying, we just lost 22 people because a president took on El Paso. And at the same time, and this is again bringing it back to politics, and I know we're going to talk about Puerto Rico later, but specifically these voters, for example, they're making connections. So that's the only thing that gives me a sense of hope, because I believe we do still live in an electoral democracy.
We hope, right?
I believe, and I'm hoping so. So that's what I think the ultimate response is. We're stuck with this. I mean, unless somebody, what's it going to take? Like, what medical doctor is going to come out and declare him pathologically ill, mentally unstable, for sure?
Well, and even that requires a congressional process. And I want to come back to sort of the politics of the crisis, because I think if you look at the trade war, a lot of, and I've said this on the show, a lot of what Trump does is stupid human tricks. I'm not sure anyone's life is at risk because of what he says about Melania being, thinking that Kim Jong-un is a great guy, and the White House can clean that up, and we'll cover it because it's bananas. But the trade war actually has real victims, and some of those real victims are the kinds of farmers and voters and families of farmers that Donald Trump really needs to vote for him if he wants to win again in 2020. And you and your colleague wrote a really smart book about sort of the politics in which we're living. What do you see as sort of the real-time political cross pressures for Trump with this botched trade war with China? Anna.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking. I didn't hear you there. I actually think that this is going to be a big problem for him. You go to North Dakota, you go to Iowa, a big pork producing state that, you know, exports a ton to China. The question is going to be, are there real-time effects when in November a lot of these farmers, you know, their bills become due? That's when they all have to pay out for their land that they're renting, the machinery that they're renting. I'm from North Dakota. I grew up on a farm. This is not just, you know, like a Washington issue that we talk about in the, you know, the ether. It's actually people being able to afford, you know, the milk and the food that they put on their table. So I do think that that's going to be something that the president and certainly his campaign team are already looking at. You've seen them try to, you know, kind of give different relief to farmers. But the question is going to be, if this continues to ratchet up, when does that economic price become too much for some of his supporters in those states? So far, I don't think you've seen that tipping point, but the question is going to be, is that in the next 6 months?
Let me give you the last word on this. This is how the New York Times describes this. American farmers have become collateral damage in a trade war that Mr. Trump began to help manufacturers and other companies that he believes have been hurt by China's unfair trade practices. While there are few signs of an imminent blue wave in farm country, a growing number of farmers say they are losing patience with the president's approach and are suggesting it will not take much to lose their vote as well.
I have always maintained that the farmers know more about trade than the president does and markets, and they know how long-term this damage is, that if the trade war ended tonight, that the wheat that China needs, they're buying from Canada. The soybeans that they need, they used to buy from us, they're buying from Brazil. Everyone's happy. That's not going to change. This is generational damage. The corn growers have put out a very strong statement. There's a lot, there's sort of new anger that's bursting out into the public view. The Farmers Union president continues to talk publicly about this, and it's they kept it quiet before the midterms. They kept it quiet through this spring, and now I think it's really a siren.
And I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin with dairy farmers. They were nervous about this. They wanted Trump to prove them wrong. They were nervous about this during the campaign. He's proven their worst fears were warranted and justified.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.